ragazzi, qui si smonta tutto. Prima non si fa più. Quei giorni qua non ci deve essere più niente. Bisogna cominciare subito. Coraggio, al lavoro, buttate giù. Dico bene, dottore?
Sì, grazie. Arrivederci, ragazzi. Ci vediamo in un prossimo film.
Lo speriamo.
Ciao, marinai.
Welcome to Cinema Italia, a podcast dedicated to the world of Italian cinema. Presented by me, John Bleasdale. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Cinema Italia. My name's John Bleasdale. I'm a critic and film writer, and I have with me Matthew Asprey Gear, who is an academic, a university lecturer, and a writer on film. He has published works on Orson Welles, amongst many other things, and he has lectured on Vittorio de Sica's Umberto D, and will be doing so this year as well. So he's a perfect person to talk to about this film, which Ingmar Bergman is once cited as his favorite film. I'm not sure if he ever said it's my favorite film of all time, but he certainly said it was a film he watched hundreds of times, and he kind of held up as an emblem of naturalistic cinema. So welcome, Matthew. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good to be here, John.
And so, right, let's have some really let's get some background on this film. This is Vittorio de Sica. It's often held up as a classic of neorealism Italian cinema. It's made in 1952. So this is maybe a little bit a later example of neorealism. Would that be correct?
Yeah, probably, and by some historical reckonings, one of the last of the kind of classic cycle, I think. So it's kind of at that moment when the neorealist filmmakers are all starting to move into different areas. So yeah, this is quite a nice, wouldn't say the final neorealist film, but it does seem like we're kind of moving towards the end of that cycle of immediate post-war films.
So what is Vittorio de Sica's sort of relationship to neorealism, and sort of how does he proceed this film?
Well, De Sica's a pretty extraordinary figure in Italian cinema, because before he became the kind of world-renowned director that everybody spoke about, he was a movie star. He was a movie star in the fascist years, and starred in those movies that were described as white telephone movies. So he was a very bankable star. But then, and he was directing films actually before the end of the Second World War. But his notable films they came after the end of the war, Shoeshine, The Bicycle Thieves, and they were really among the most celebrated of all the neorealist films, and really seemed to signal something very new. And I think De Sica's what he particularly brought as a director to neorealism was some of the knowledge he had as an actor, because he was working sometimes with non-professionals, like many of the neorealists. But I think of all those directors like Visconti and Rossellini, the performances in De Sica's films by non-professionals are, by my reckoning, better than in any other neorealist films, because I think he thought like an actor, and he knew how to, I guess, teach novice actors skills that they could use that really do create tremendous performances. And I think Umberto D is a great example of what you can get out of a non-professional actor.
Yeah, it's interesting that his son is also a famous actor in contemporary Italian cinema, although unfortunately his career has been, almost exclusively the cinema panettone, the sort of sex comedies that come out every Christmas. It's cinema panettone, to translate, it's like Christmas cake cinema, because it stands for this. I guess the nearest British listeners would recognize would be a Carry On movies, seasonally inflected. So the apple fell quite far from the tree, although they do look very similar physically. They're very the face is very similar of both Christian and Vittorio De Sica. This film as well is dedicated to Vittorio De Sica's father, and so that just right at the very beginning you have this idea of the respect for the elderly. Could you tell us, maybe give us a quick idea of what the film is about and the story?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the title character, Umberto D, is a retired gentleman. We don't learn very much at all about his past, except that he worked in civil service or something for many years. But he's struggling to survive on the pension that he has been given. And that was not unique, because the film starts with a protest of pensioners against the very meager allowance that they're being given. But Umberto is living as a lodger in the house of a woman who is clearly becoming very impatient with having him there at all. She wants to get rid of him. He owes her money. And yes, it's the story of his increasing desperation, trying to pull together enough cash to pay off the debts he owes. And so that's the basic setup of the film. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. What have I missed something important?
Well, I'd add two things, which would be like his friends in the world. Obviously, the most famously the dog Flike, which is sometimes translated in subtitles as, I think, Flag. They sometimes, but for some reason, some subtitled versions of the film have that name, but Flike is the dog's name, who has to go as, like, that's co-star status for the.
For sure, I think he might have been a professional actor, Flike. So I think his real name was Napoleon. So.
The irony of that. Also, the landlady is played by a famous opera singer and sort of operetta singer and glamorous star in herself. And that kind of keys in with her role as well, because she is this sort of upwardly mobile, well-to-do woman of show, you know. And the other sort of subplot, if you like, which isn't directly related to his own ordeal, is that of the housemaid, who the young woman who kind of befriends him and visits him when he's sick, called Maria. She's played by Maria-Pia Casilio, who, like Carlo Battisti, who plays Umberto D, both of these were non-professional actors.
She went on to have a pretty significant career as an actress. This was her first movie. She's in a few later De Sica films, and had quite a career in the 50s.
Yeah, she was sort of fished out of the audition. It was that. I mean, I'm always slightly suspicious of that copy when you read about someone who, I was just accompanying a friend to the audition and then I got chosen. I've read that in so many stories that I sometimes think, yeah, you wanted to be picked out.
I think that's the way to get the role, to be the friend of the person auditioning.
Just make sure your friend's rubbish.
Yeah.
Sit beside them and then you'll get picked. That's, and I mean, the beginning of the film, as you say, it's we sort of begin with a real sense that this is a film which is going to say something about Italy in the post-war years, because it starts with a political demonstration in the heart of Rome. And it's all these old people in their hats and their overcoats, and they're sort of kicking up a fuss.
Yeah, and what De Sica does with that is really interesting, I think, because could have been easy for this to be a more sort of ideologically driven social film. I mean, in the neorealist movement, there are a number of those, like La Terra Tremor and so on, very much about the kind of collective story of people who are suffering. But no, we even at the opening protest, some of the other pensioners who were there protesting kind of indicate that they're all coming from different degrees of desperation. And so very quickly, this becomes the story of one man, as well as the friends, as you say, he has in this boarding house he lives in, more so than a kind of story that takes us into a broader social issue.
I mean, in a way, if you look outside of Italy as well, this film sort of speaks. So there was an American movie around about this time about a couple. I can't remember the name of. I'm gonna stumble, but it was about a couple who were potentially going to be separated because they couldn't afford to live together, and they were like an old retired couple, and it was about their families. I'm going to Google that in a second and get back to you on the title. But that idea of the old generation kind of, what did Heidegger say? You can die too young and that's a tragedy, but you can also die too old and that's a tragedy, and that seems to be the case in this film.
Yeah, Umberto D. I mean, he seems to be a bit obsolete. He's not actually that old, I guess. I don't know how old the actor was, but I guess he's sort of maybe around 70 or something. But I guess in those days in Italy, that was considered pretty elderly. But I think because he doesn't seem to have any family connection, he's sort of retired to a very solitary life, and he doesn't serve much purpose in any respect. So he is, I guess, unlike many people of that elderly generation at the time, he doesn't have a family to sort of fall back on, which would be a very different story. He has this kind of, he has his dog, and he has his friendship with the housemaid, but the other friends we glimpse, who he sort of sees on the street and kind of quite desperately, seeks some help from, have very little time for him at all. So he's sort of somebody who, in his lack of family and real close friends, has wound up being virtually useless to the society. And De Sica both makes this extremely compassionate, but Umberto is also a real character, and you can kind of see why some of his friends might walk away from him pretty quickly, because he's by no means an idealized, sentimental older gentleman, as I think would have been very easy for many directors to portray. So, yeah, he's somebody who you can kind of see the path that led to where he is, even though he doesn't remain, he's never unsympathetic, but he is a character, which I think is one reason why this film is so rich.
Yeah, I mean, right at the beginning, he's sort of like taking people's food off them while they're trying to eat,
Right.
and they're kind of quite hungry, and you can imagine that not being... I never quite understood why he's doing that. Is he just distracting the waitress so that she doesn't see the dog?
I think that's what he's doing. He's feeding his dog under the table with his leftovers, and by kind of, being the kind of helpful customer, helping the waitress take the other people's plates away. He's kind of hiding the dog, gobbling up the rest of the pasta.
Even though the other people are like old people like him who are really hungry and poor and they need their food. By the way, the name of the film that I could remember is Make Way for Tomorrow, Leo McCarey, and actually kind of predates this by quite some time. It's 1937, so it's a good...
It's a Depression era film.
Yeah, exactly. 15 years. But yes, very, very much a Depression era film. It's funny how America's making something which is very about the economic problems of being old, and how society and also young people don't really want you around anymore. And then post-war, Italy's making the same film. Yeah. Did you want to add something to that? I saw you looking pensive.
just in the sense that if you watch a lot of neorealist films of this era, you can kind of track the very rapid economic rehabilitation of Italy after, the devastation of the war. And, the immediately post-war neorealist films show a very impoverished Italy, particularly in the South. By the time we get into the early 50s, things have clearly improved, and the tone of the films generally tends to be a lot lighter. But obviously that's not true for everybody in that society. And so the plight of the elderly is a particular problem that was clearly in the background while the Italian miracle was starting to gain speed in the 50s.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the landlady sort of trying to kick him out is a sign of her prosperity. She's trying to renovate the building, and she needs him. It's like people who live in rent-controlled apartments in New York, in an area of gentrification. They need to be, get rid of these guys, so I can move my family in, or I can move someone who's going to pay more for the room. So Umberto sort of goes on a kind of he's kind of spends a lot of time wandering Rome, and this is a film where you get, well, a little bit like Bicycle Thieves as well. There is that sort of Odysseus-like journey that is taking place, or maybe better still, Ulysses, from James Joyce, that sort of wandering around the city, and so you get a portrait of the city as well, which adds to that sort of state of Italy aspect to the film.
And this is not really La Dolce Vita Rome. This is very sunny 50s Rome, but it gives you a great sense of the city, not even 10 years after the end of fascism. It's really, I think there was some studio work. I think all the stuff done in the apartment is as a studio creation, but there's a lot of stuff that takes place out in the streets, as neorealism had always tried to do. So really great sense of this place and time.
I wanted to ask about that as well. How when we're talking about neorealism, and we're thinking of people like De Sica and Rossellini, obviously as possibly the first neorealist, what are you looking at that is saying to you this is definitely a neorealist film? And sort of, we were already mentioning this is a later example, and so it's so what are the differences, or what are the similarities between this and an earlier example like Shoeshine or The Bicycle Thieves?
Well, I mean, De Sica always said that it wasn't the case that he met with Visconti and Rossellini and they hammered out a manifesto of neorealism. Maybe Cesar Zavattini, who wrote this film, was the theorist of this movement. But in De Sica's eyes, it was really a type of filmmaking that emerged by necessity, because the resources of the Italian film industry were so destroyed as a consequence of the war. So that if they, people like Rossellini wanted to make a film, they had to scrape together whatever money, whatever equipment, film stock they possibly could. And so in a way, the things that neorealism is famous for, using real locations and natural light and so on, were in many cases, I think, just a consequence of the only way to make films in that immediate post-war era. But another aspect of it, too, is this was the first time these filmmakers had the opportunity to really tell stories about what Italy was really like after 20 years of fascism. So the reality of Italy was not really, it never really been on screen, and they lived through an incredibly awful experience. I think the early films have that energy. They are inspiring, and they were inspiring to many other filmmakers, because it showed that people could just scrape together a film with virtually nothing. But then as time went on and things became more professionalized, some of the filmmakers of the movement started to, I think, just develop their own approaches that, they weren't necessarily concerned with being purists. I certainly don't.
Sorry, I just lost you.
into their own more personal filmmaking styles.
Sorry, I just lost you a second there, Matt. You were
You want me
it
to
was
start again?
well, it was just like it was literally like 10 seconds back.
Okay. I might say the whole thing again, so because
Okay.
I'll get lost otherwise.
Okay, go ahead.
So the question was about
It was about the neo-realism and the aspects and how it had developed to this stage.
right. I think De Sica, he said and admitted that there was never a time when, he sat down with Roberto Rossellini and Visconti and they hammered out a kind of manifesto of neorealism. It was very much, I think, an approach to filmmaking born of the very specific circumstances after the Second World War and the limitations because of the way the Italian film industry had been destroyed. So they were working, particularly Visconti's early films like Rome Open City, they were working with whatever materials they could gather. They didn't have almost any money. They were using scraps of film stock. And so what we know as Italian neorealism, defined by the use of real locations and natural lighting and so on, was, I think, in many cases a consequence of that particular set of circumstances. So, yes, the immediate post-war films of neorealism do have a lot in common. There was that scrappiness to them, the sense that this was a very new type of cinema out on the streets. And then eventually, as the film industry recuperated, and I think these individual directors were never exactly purists, so they sort of developed along their own lines. And so by the time we get to something like Umberto D in the early 50s, but De Sica is really, he's continuing much of the mode of working that he had used in earlier films like Shoeshine and Bicycle Thieves, but I don't think he has any sort of purist agenda. The purist here was the screenwriter Cesar Zavattini, who wrote 20 films for De Sica, but was very much the kind of cheerleader of the movement and its theorist. But I don't think De Sica was anywhere near as committed to neorealism as a project. So
I think
that answers the question.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. It's really. I think the thing that really surprised me when I saw Bicycle Thieves, which was the first De Sica I saw it on the big screen as well. I was very fortunate to see. It's always great to see a film like that for the first time, in the dimensions it was meant to be seen. I had in my head realism as being something I'd seen in the 1980s as being sort of like a handheld camera or something Ken Loach or some sort of sense of working class authenticity, but kind of a little bit drab as well as one of the things. And what you see in Umberto D as well as in his previous films, I think, but I by all means push back, is that there's actually a real sort of operatic sense to these films, that there's a real aesthetic sense to that. They're not devoid, they're not completely bare in that sense. I mean, I'll give you an example in Umberto D. The demonstration at the beginning, of course, but also when they're going to the cafe, the way that the space in the canteen is organized, it's not like a cramped cafe. It's like it's quite cavernous and big and echoey, and it's full of people. And there's just this sense of course, this is a poor place. This is where people are getting cheap meals, but there's still a sense of space, and the way the space has been organized by the director feels theatrical,
Well, yeah, I mean, you can also credit the cinematographer, the great G.R. Aldo, who also shot La Terra Trema and other De Sica films, for his wide-angle cinematography and that deep focus that was such a feature of the movement. But I guess that just goes to show that, realism in any of its manifestations is as artificial as expressionism. It's the illusion that what we're looking on screen is reality. There's no such thing as reality on screen. It's just the intention of the director to create that illusion. And in different times, there are going to be different approaches to that, which signal to an audience that what they're looking at is reality. So, yeah, this was not a time really there could be handheld cameras. The cameras were too big. That's something that came later. And yeah, and I think De Sica, among the sort of big names of neorealism, was really he was a great poet of the cinema, someone who was able to find the poetry in these images of supposedly drab reality in post-war Italy. So it may not seem to have that kind of, the sense that we are just glimpsing real life on screen that it might have had if we saw this in the in early 1950s. I've also seen, if you look at Paisan, the Rossellini film, it incorporates a lot of newsreel footage. And so it moves back and forth between newsreel footage of the war and then these dramatic reenactments. And I think for the average person in the 1940s, because of the use of black and white cinematography for newsreels, reality seemed, at least as it appeared on screen, corresponded to the aesthetics of the newsreel. So today we see a black and white newsreel from the 40s. We don't think that is really the visual language of realism, but I think in the 40s that very much would have been the immediate response of the audience.
Yeah, sort of visually ripped from the headlines as an aesthetic, if you like. Famously, obviously, Citizen Kane and its opening sort of pastiche of newsreel would be a visual parallel to that. When you have Umberto going to these various different things, and he sort of, as you say, he's meeting his old people. He goes into a hospital, which again, look, it's huge. It's such
it's the lens. It's all in the lens.
Yeah.
That deep focus. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that is the thing. Every image you can see all the way back to the back of the hall, the back of the room.
It's another debt to Citizen Kane.
Yes, right.
In fact, Aldo had worked with Orson Welles on Othello, which had just been shot. So,
right. Yeah. Is that Othello predates Umberto D?
Othello was released in 1951, I believe. It took several years to make, so it was being made in the late 40s. And Aldo was one of several cinematographers who worked on that. Yeah.
Right, that's an interesting connection. Yeah, absolutely. So he's going to these different places. A hospital. He at one point he loses Flike, and he goes and he thinks that Flike might have been caught and killed. And you again, it's almost the Bicycle Thieves does the same thing, where you sort of see behind the scenes of loads of very specific social moments, which we're not used to seeing. It's almost. It has that same interest that a documentary has, of sort of like, do you ever wonder how this was done, or do you ever wonder what happens to dogs that go missing? Here's the reality. Do you think this, it's a slightly difficult question, but from a domestic point of view, from Italians watching this film, is this a way of them sort of rebuilding their identity as well post-war?
Well, I think De Sica said that the audiences didn't like this movie. I don't know how well it fared at the box office. I don't think it really made very much money in Italy. And generally, as far as I know, De Sica's work as a director, he did occasionally do much more commercially orientated projects, particularly later, but he was always facing a great deal of difficulty getting his passion projects on screen. I don't think this was really these were not the movies that the Italian audiences necessarily wanted to see by this point. Certainly there were lots of other films that were making a lot of money, but I think this is probably I mean, I think it was probably accused in some quarters, if I remember, of being too much of a downer and too much of a negative portrait of the state of Italy after the war. So I think we look at this today and we recognize its importance to Italian cinema after the war, but I don't think Italians particularly were that keen to see this sort of thing on screen.
Giulio Andreotti, who was the culture minister of the time, came out vocally against the film for precisely that reason.
Oh.
Andreotti would go on to be the subject of Il Divo, the film by Paolo Sorrentino. That speaks to his longevity. That he was he just went on and on and on. He's one of his quotes, which became famous. Andreotti, this sort of Machiavellian politician, was that politics grows in shit. That was his public statement of his own political philosophy.
That's one for Bartlett's quotations, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. Maybe it sounds a little bit more refined in Italian, but it's I don't think it is. I don't think it's that far from
Probably
that.
sounds worse.
Exactly.
But well, I mean, that does raise a good point too. I mean, if we are looking at the evolution of neorealism, because in the immediate post-war films, there was a kind of liberty for those filmmakers in terms of they were basically free, well, to some extent free of censorship in a way that would not be the case by the time we get to the late 40s. After the 1948 election, there was a lot more ability on the part of the government to exercise some censorship. And so, yeah, a lot of the films were, to some degree hamstrung in what they could really, how hard-hitting they could be. I mean, even today, you look at Rome Open City, and it's quite shocking in its violence. It's really explicit, torture scenes, and it does have that feeling of being made in a kind of atmosphere of chaos where nobody was really able to control the material. But yeah, that was not really the case after 1948. So, yeah.
I mean, one of the most shocking elements of the film from an Italian audience, and certainly from the vision of government ministers and the church and whatnot, would be the subplot involving Maria, friend of Umberto D, and because she is, she's pregnant, and which is bad enough as an unmarried mother in terms of the social mores of the time and the religious teaching of the time, which is still, overwhelmingly Catholic. But she also doesn't know the identity of the father, so it's quite obvious that she's sexually active in a way that is not only outside matrimony, but well, there would be words for it in Italian which would be very insulting.
Well, that was something Zavattini, the screenwriter, seemed particularly interested in examining on screen. I mean, he made, there's a film, an omnibus film that came out a couple years later, Love in the City. And Zavattini was kind of the ringleader behind that film. So it has about 6 segments by different directors. And Zavattini himself co-directed one of the segments with Francesco Maselli, who just died very recently, called The Story of Caterina, which is a story about a young unwed mother and, who is eventually, because of the terrible poverty that she has to live in, eventually she winds up abandoning the child. And this was based on a real incident that took place. And the remarkable thing is the actual woman played the mother. And it's Zavattini pushing the neorealist approach to a kind of extreme level, really. But that very theme of the limited options of women who are not married, who are pregnant, it runs for a lot of these films in a compassionate way. I mean, Love in the City generally touches on this circumstance in its other segments as well. But I mean, Umberto D you do get a sense from the film that it is giving a real insight into the situation this girl's in. The fact that her problems, in a way, are probably much more profound than the problems Umberto's in, even though the focus of the film is on the old man's dilemma. It makes it all very kind of complex and fascinating. And I like that the film doesn't in any way condemn Maria in the way that Italian society would have condemned her at the time.
Yeah, and it sort of bookends you've got both demographics, if you like. That you've got the very old guy, and then the unborn child, and the mother as an opposite end to that, but sort of like almost unlikely allies in that they're both to some degree outside of what society deems as appropriate or useful.
Well, this Sica really likes the juxtaposition of characters of different generations. I mean, Bicycle Thieves is a great example with the father and the son, and two women with the mother and the daughter. It seemed to be a dramatic approach he was called. Maybe Zavattini needs to get credit for that, but you see it in several of his films. Yeah.
The original title of the film was, I think, was A Man and His Dog, and Umberto D became sort of, I'm not sure if it was a working title, but then they decided we prefer that. The D is the middle initial, I think, of his name, of the main character's name. I was rewatching this. I was kind of I can't help but think of films about people with their dogs. There's a science fiction film based on a Harlan Ellison short story called A Boy and His Dog with Don Johnson from the 1970s. And any number of apocalyptic films use the man and dog trope as, from I Am Legend through to The Road. A Boy and His Dog is apocalyptic as well. I don't know. You used the word earlier, and I kind of want to sort of get your thoughts on this. Sentimentality. How does this film manage to pull your heartstrings so much and be so sentimental, and yet not fall entirely into the sort of sentimentality swamp?
I mean, there's that old rule of screenwriting that if you want to make a character likable, give the character a dog to love. Because if a character loves something, they can't be all bad. And this is, I think, a great example of that. But the sentimental, I guess the way that it escapes sentimentality is because, as I said, I think Umberto, is a complicated character, and in some ways, he's his own worst enemy in some ways, I think. But I think, too, the fact that this film resolves itself, if it doesn't really resolve itself. I mean, we end with something that's both hopeful, but we also get a sense that whatever solution Umberto needs to take, it's not going to be easily arrived at, and it's kind of not the point of the film, because it's not really your standard arc of a kind of sentimental film about a man and a dog. I mean, you can imagine how this film would be reworked if it was remade into a Hollywood film. Just couldn't work the way that it does in this one.
I mean, I think that's one of those questions that comes up a lot watching films from this period as well, is one of the reasons they seem to break through to an international audience and an English language audience, and therefore more America than anything else. I mean, bounces off America and hits England as well, but the rest of the English-speaking world. But it's really New York that has to be convinced that these films are interesting. Is that it's Italy returning to international filmmaking. Italy was huge in the silent era and was, in many ways in the forefront. Italy and France were in the fourth, and Germany, of making films in a way that really challenged Hollywood. As Hollywood was just one of many centers of film rather than being synonymous with filmmaking. So when these Italian films start coming out post-war, because you've had that period where no one was watching Italian films in the English-speaking world, you have all these fresh talents that have just been simmering there and developing and maturing, and they burst, fully formed like a goddess from Zeus's ear. And there is a little bit of an element that I do sometimes wonder is so, for instance, a production design element of an Italian film in this period is that they're filming in Rome. If you shoot a film which is set entirely outdoors, it makes a difference if you're shooting it in bomb-strewn Coventry or shooting in Rome or Florence. That makes a really big difference. And likewise, if you're doing something which is kind of sentimental, you maybe get away with it a little bit more if it's subtitled rather than if it's James Stewart talking to a giant rabbit.
Well, maybe that's true. I mean,
or is that too cynical? That sounded more cynical than I wanted it to be, to tell you the truth. But
it might be a fair point that sometimes as audiences, English-speaking audiences, watching foreign language films, we may tolerate things in those films that we would maybe not be so tolerant of in a Hollywood production. But that said, I think the reason that this film sort of spoke to the world, as it seems to have done, is there's something very timeless about this story, and that kind of, I think, I mean, although it's a story very specifically about a social condition in post-war Italy, it seems to be a story that could exist anywhere. And I think that's why probably what Bergman was celebrating about it was a kind of a timeless tale, and it has something of the purity of a fable, I think. So I think it is a very moving story emotionally, but I don't really find it sentimental.
No, I don't either. I mean, again, I sort of slightly retract that. But when I was rewatching it, I was really thinking, my God, this is on a knife edge, And
but that's why it works so well, I think.
But precisely, yeah.
You don't feel you're being too manipulated. And when dogs are on screen, that's a very common thing to take place.
Absolutely. And of course, you've got like Bergman's making Wild Strawberries. Kurosawa's making Ikuru. Thank you very much. It's one of those film titles you read and never have to say. So Ikuru, which has recently been remade as Living, which I've not yet seen, but strikes me as a bit unnecessary. But I've not yet seen, so I shouldn't judge. So this idea of, as you say, this universality of this dilemma, I mean, even goes back to Lear. What do you do with the king when he's not a king? What do you do with somebody when they've served their purpose? And in a way, that might be what makes a film less sentimental, because the sort of solution of what to do is come to quite early on. And the real question is no longer what to do or why, but how. It just comes down to a basic, how do I go about doing this? And that is, that makes it kind of weirdly pragmatic and unromantic about, spoiler alert, he doesn't see a very good way out of his solution. He's hopeless.
I mean, for me, it's an ending a little bit like the Beckett ending, where I can't go on, I will go on. It's sort of we don't know how he's going to get out of this immediate predicament, or even if he does. But, I mean, the film could end very despairingly if it ended with what he considers doing. But instead, it ends on this kind of moment of, we're at this sort of point of okay, he's gone to the edge of the darkness, this character, and he's kind of retreated now, and there is some sense that okay, he's going to pick himself up and figure out how he's going to continue. But another reason this film, I think, escapes sentimentality is that it it goes very frighteningly close to that edge of darkness. And so it's both it's a funny film in many ways, and I have to kind of check myself, because I sort of my first instinct is to think of this as a bit of a comedy, because it is quite funny at times. But it's also a very dark film, and it doesn't give any easy answer to the predicament the way that sentimental films do. The sentimental film leaves you feeling like everything's resolved, and the whatever emotional challenge is involved has been resolved, but not in the case of this film.
No, absolutely not. I'm glad you brought up the comic aspect as well, because it's something we haven't really talked about yet, and that is, there's a lot of satire in here. As in terms of the landlady, for instance, is a wonderful portrayal, but also him and Flick and their various sort of adventures have a sort of shaggy dog story element to them, if you like.
Yeah, it's I think the interaction between Umberto and the maid too is quite comical, because when she's looking out of his window at one of her boyfriends, and he's kind of not really interested in anything she's excited about, and she's not really that interested in anything that he's concerned about. And the fact that these two characters are, they have their own lives going on that are, that have their challenges, winds up being quite comic. Even though that they're not on the same page in most respects, they still clearly are affectionate towards each other. So, yeah, I think of this in a very, I think De Sica he was a great comedian. I mean, if you've seen him perform, he was an absolute master comedian. And I think no matter what he was doing, that comic sensibility was always there, which is not the case necessarily with, say, Visconti or someone like that.
Absolutely. I mean, even right up until that final scene where you have the railway crossing, there's a lovely bit of detail where the guy with a flag, who's obviously like the station master or the crossing guard or something, and he's stopping people from going and arguing with the motorist, because the motorist is going, "Come on, let me go," and he's like, "No, there's a train coming. What do you want to do?" And while they're having this argument, Umberto D is sort of wandering towards the tracks with his dog in his arms and a dark thought in his heart. I mean, that point as well, you just mentioned earlier, the edge of darkness. He goes to the edge of darkness. I mean, that is one of the stunning shots of the film. It really it reminded me a little bit of that apocryphal story of the first audience watching the film of the train arriving in the station, all dodging out of the way. It really is a moment in film where you feel the violence and the proximity of a violent train bearing down on you.
And it's also all the swirling dust, and I mean, it's an incredible shot. And I guess, it's difficult to really know how close that actor was standing to the train. And I guess, the camera helps create the impression that he's very close. But whatever they did, it's horrifying. And, the despair of the man at that moment when the dog breaks free and he's kind of blinded by the dust and crying for the dog. I mean, it's heartbreaking.
And we don't know if the dog has run out onto the tracks or run away or what the situation is.
Yeah. So there's this incredible human drama, but mixed in with very gentle comedy at times, and and De Sica never seems in this film to put a foot wrong in terms of negotiating those modes, which I think is why this is so remarkable. Because it would be so easy to get this wrong, and most of the time, films do get it slightly wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's as I've already sort of alluded to, it's kind of a balancing act, and a very, very delicate one. I mean, I love this film, and I love that ending. I think it's what you're talking about earlier. It's absolutely true that there is this sense of this could just be a delay, this could be a change of heart, and you just don't know, and there's no way of knowing. But there is a sort of hint, I think, in as he's walking away, you have like a whole bunch of children just sort of rush in between him and the camera, so that we are, you know, we do get that circle of life goes on feel to the ending. His individual story might be almost over, but there are still things will carry on.
I think very much present in this film too this is a film about a kind of humbling of this character. Not quite sure he is humbled by the end of the film, but because he's not, yes, he's in a dire situation, but many people are in much worse situations in Rome at this time. And I don't think the film is blind to that. This is a character who was, seems like to have been a relatively kind of more middle-class character in his earlier years, who's now, down and out. And you see that in the pride that he takes in the way that he dresses. He has he's virtually nothing left, but he does always have his very nice suit clean, and he always looks very presentable and takes great pride in appearances, as middle-class people do. And the crisis is, I think, the fact that he's desperately afraid of having to wind up in the shelter, as he describes it. So it's about somebody sort of slipping out of their class as much as it is he is falling into poverty, of course, but I think the class element is very much present here too. And he's not really aware of that, but we are as an audience, and the filmmaker certainly is.
There's almost a sense that if he wasn't middle class, he would be much more resilient because he'd be part of a bigger community as well, and there would be more. But that he's an independent man living on. De Sica does this brilliantly as well in his casting, because Carlo Battisti was like a Florence professor of languages, and so he is somebody who's spent his whole life being received with respect and all that sort of stuff, and so. Yeah, there is a humbling happening here.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I've taught this film, one of the students in my class said that if he had no idea that Carlo Battisti was not a professional actor, he was somebody who had his own career, as you say, as a professor. And he said, I thought this was like Italy's greatest actor, performing. You get the sense this is a powerhouse performance by a master actor, but in fact, no, it's somebody. And I think that was De Sica's great talent. And it's the idea of the neorealist casting is instead of bringing in a professional actor to play a character, you go to the source, you find somebody who approximates that character's position in society usually, and then you teach them how to act. And you see La Terra Trema or Paisan, and sometimes, the acting is not always so strong. There are some pretty awkward moments, but with De Sica, he really does elevate the performance to something that is spectacular, and he makes a great argument for that approach to casting. That you can get somebody who has enough similarities to the character that the only real necessary step is to teach that person to act well enough to get it across.
Yeah. One question I wanted to, in fact, I wanted to sort of close on was you're teaching this in as part of your course. What reactions do you get from first-time viewers? So some people must be watching it for the first time when you're talking to them.
Yeah, well, I programmed this in the first week of my course on post-war Italian cinema, because I pair it with Paisan, because Paisan's one of the earliest of the neorealist films by Rossellini, and then this is kind of the towards the end of the cycle, so it makes a nice sort of, you see the beginning and towards the end. But the reaction to Umberto D tends to be, extremely positive. It's I think probably one of the films in the course people like most, and I won't say it's been forgotten, but De Sica generally seems to be not spoken about too much these days. for a long time, Bicycle Thieves particularly was always spoken about as one of the great, top 10 films, and I think it made the Sight and Sound list several times. But I'm kind of surprised myself because I've gone back into looking at all this De Sica stuff again, and I'm kind of surprised so few people really talk about De Sica these days, because I think he was, I mean, the number of great movies he was responsible for directing is pretty significant. 5, 6, 7 great movies, I think, and not too many directors can claim that. But yeah, so the response to Umberto D is always extremely positive. I think it very much deserves its status as a classic, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that about if you like, a sort of canon of films, not like necessarily the Sight and Sound list, but I remember growing up in the 80s and being the first time I was interested in cinema, and it was Bicycle Thieves, Seventh Seal, Seven Samurai, Citizen Kane, and there was this list that that everybody kind of, all the books agreed on, everybody agreed on, these are the films you have to see. And or if you read an interview with Stanley Kubrick, those were the films he listed. Yeah, but the 80s is now 40 years ago, and the sands have shifted. The sands have shifted through the hourglass.
I don't want to give the impression that I think that these lists should remain static, and I think this conversation is always ongoing, and it's impossible to have any sort of definitive list of anything. But I think maybe De Sica has been left behind a little bit. I mean, there's kind of, he's recognized for his role in the history of cinema, but I think there's a lot to rediscover there. I mean, there's the key classic films like Shoeshine and Bicycle Thieves, and Miracle in Milan, which we haven't mentioned, which is another wonderful, wonderful film that it's kind of neorealist, but it's also a kind of fantastical film.
I wanted to bring that one up simply because during COVID, I did a series of lessons for my university class, and I emailed a lot of people to volunteer and come in and do a lesson for me, because we were locked down and we were the first bunch to be locked down. So we weren't quite sure how it was going to pan out. And Armando Iannucci, the great writer and director, very generously went, "Yeah, I'll do it. And he proposed Miracle a Milan, or Miracle in Milan, which I'd never seen. And yeah, that is a stunning and surprising film. And it doesn't really fit into the neorealism sort of box as neatly as say Bicycle Thieves or Shoeshine or Umberto D does, because of this magical element which you just mentioned.
But it's Zavattini writing the script and De Sica directing, and it's about a shanty town on the edge of Milan, and I think it just shows that there is no real purity of neorealism. It was a very useful sort of set of approaches to making films, and I guess themes, but it's not limiting. And yeah, so De Sica, I mean, just those 4 films in that core neorealist moment would alone, for me, make him one of the great directors. But he made many other great films as well. And
yeah, he had a whole second act in the 60s where
he was continuing to direct up until the early 70s when he died. And yeah, but I mean, Two Women, I think, is another tremendously great film with Sophia Loren. And yeah, there's and he actually made some just very frankly very entertaining comedies that maybe don't have the pretense to being great works of art, but are nevertheless
Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow,
yeah, right.
and Marriage Italian Style are 2 of my favorite Italian comedies, definitely.
I'll recommend De Sica, not a film he directed himself, but a film he appears in with Sophia Loren and Marcello Mastroianni called, well, the English title is Too Bad She's Bad, from 1955. And I think this is a hilarious kind of Italian screwball comedy from the mid-50s, very early on in the careers of Loren and Mastroianni. And De Sica is also just wonderful playing Loren's father. So
Super. I'm going to hunt that out. Have you got the Italian title there?
I don't have it right here.
Okay,
and
no,
I
it's
don't
okay.
speak Italian, but
I'll-
it's
yeah.
directed by Alessandra Blasetti from 55. So Too Bad,
right.
She's Bad.
Okay, I'm going to look that up. And he also directed Peter Sellers in After the Fox, which was is one of those Peter Sellers films that always seem to be on during Easter holidays.
Yeah, he made a lot of films, and it's true that in the later years, his reputation, when he was alive, his reputation declined. I think the French New Wave didn't seem to like De Sica very much. Andre Bazin did celebrate him, but he wasn't celebrated the way Rossellini was. But yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say
I'm on Team De Sica.
Yeah, I was Rossellini was like the godfather of like Jean-Luc Godard was absolutely in hock to him, and
Truffaut was his assistant. And,
yeah. I remember there's a story about them. He's driving Rossellini back to the airport, Godard, which kind of shows as well how, I'll ferry you about and everything. And Godard was saying, "Oh, what did you think of my recent?" He was waiting to hear the opinion of the master about his latest film, and Rossellini said, "Oh, it was a little bit. It smacked. There's a danger of Antonioniism here," and Godard drove off the road. He was so shocked and upset that he was being accused of being like Antonioni. And
ouch.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I really like Antonioni. So I'm not. But these camps were being set up, and you couldn't. Sure. So yeah, you can't just like everybody. You have to pit them against each other. Otherwise, you're not Jean-Luc Godard.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, I've always felt the French New Wave directors were much better directors than critics. So even though that's where they started, but De Sica. I think maybe it's because De Sica and Zavattini were such a partnership for so many years, and it's hard to find an auteur if the auteur has a screenwriter writing all the movies. I don't know.
Right? Yeah. But I don't know. I like Billy Wilder and A.I. Diamond and Hitchcock and Lehman, and I like these partnerships. I think they're I think they're a good thing.
Sometimes working in teams is good for the movie. Sometimes it's great when one person's behind it. But
yeah, absolutely. So, Matt, can people sort of join your course online? Can they sign up to your courses?
Sure. I run this Italian course. Will be back. I kind of run them on a sort of cycle, so they come back every 6 months or so. So if you take a look at my website, MatthewAspreyGear.com, you'll see when it's scheduled. And I have many other film courses I run as well. But it's a very low pressure 12-week course that, the only homework is to watch the movies. And most people manage to do that. And it leads to really interesting discussions, and they're usually pretty international groups of people. So we get many different responses to these films, and I've really loved jumping back into this cinema, which we know the kind of the key big titles, but when preparing it and having to really seek out lesser known films, both in neorealism, but the course moves all the way up to the end of the 50s. So we look at other filmmakers and different types of films as well. So it's been very rewarding to do that kind of really intense study of Italian cinema in this golden age.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope you'll come back on the podcast and talk about another film at some point in the future.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. Thank you.
Lo speriamo.